lost their wands, their maps, their reasons to hate each other. What they couldn't lose, no matter how hard they tried, was each other. Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The last thing Hermione remembered before the world turned inside out was the smell of salt. Not the pleasant, breezy kind that comes with holidays and sunlit coastlines. This was something older, heavier, the kind of salt that clings to the inside of your throat and reminds you, with quiet insistence, that the sea is not your friend. It had been there in the air of the ministry's portkey chamber, threaded through the sterile scent of polished marble and bureaucratic parchment. And she had noticed it the way you notice a wrong note in a familiar song. Briefly, distantly, and then not at all. Then the portkey activated, and everything became noise and light, and the terrible, boneless sensation of being pulled through a place that had no walls. She landed badly. The ground came up faster than expected, rough, uneven, volcanic rock that bit through the knees of her robes and scraped the heels of her palms. The impact shuddered up through her wrists and elbows, and she stayed there for a moment on all fours, breathing through her nose in short, measured counts, the way she'd trained herself to do in the months after the war. 4 in, hold, 4 out. The technique had been recommended by a healer at St. Mungo's who'd spoken very gently about trauma responses and grounding exercises, and at the time, Hermione had found it vaguely condescending. Now she used it constantly, and she'd never told anyone that. 4 in, hold, 4 out. She raised her head. The island, if it could be called that, this jagged black tooth of rock rising from grey water, stretched perhaps half a mile in either direction. Sparse, wind-bent trees clutched at the higher ground like arthritic fingers. Below them, the shore was a broken line of dark stone and pale sand, and the sea came at it from every angle with the low, relentless rhythm of something that had been doing this for a very long time and intended to continue indefinitely. The sky sat flat and colourless overhead, the kind of sky that wasn't quite overcast but offered no real light either, a sky the colour of an old scar. There was no ministry chamber, no colleagues, no mission briefing documents neatly tucked under her arm. There was only the island, the sea, the sky, and Draco Malfoy, approximately 4 feet to her left, pushing himself upright from the rock with the unhurried precision of a man who had decided that showing pain was a strategic error. She watched him straighten. He was taller than she'd registered in the handful of ministry corridors where they'd passed each other over the past 2 years. Taller, or perhaps just more vertical than she'd expected him to be here, against this stripped and elemental backdrop. The wind came off the water and moved through his hair, and he didn't reach up to fix it, which struck her as oddly significant, though she couldn't immediately have said why. His eyes found hers, grey, always that specific grey, the colour of the sky before a storm commits to itself. Neither of them spoke. This was, she realised, perhaps the closest they'd stood to each other since the war ended. The ministry's corridors had a particular talent for keeping people apart. There were always other bodies, other conversations, the comfortable social machinery of people who had agreed without discussion to behave as though certain things had not happened. She had found this arrangement acceptable. She had found it, if she was honest with herself, something of a relief. There was no social machinery here. Granger, His voice was flat, careful, stripped of the drawling cruelty she'd spent 6 years cataloguing. It was simply a word, her name, a confirmation, perhaps, that she was real and present, and that this was actually happening. Malfoy. Hers was equally flat. She was proud of that. He looked past her, scanning the island with the systematic attention she'd have expected from an aura, but not, she realized, from him. Until she remembered that he had spent the better part of his 7th year performing threat assessments in darkened corridors, and that certain habits don't unknit themselves just because a war ends. "The port key malfunctioned," he said. "Yes. We're not where we're supposed to be. Also, yes." A pause. The sea filled it with the sound of itself. "Your wand," he said, not a question. Hermione reached for it automatically, the gesture so ingrained it happened before thought, and her hand found nothing. The inner pocket of her ministry robes, precisely where she always kept it, offered only the faint warmth of fabric and the cold understanding that something was very wrong. She checked the outer pocket, the left sleeve, the small interior pocket she kept for emergencies, which had never failed her until this precise moment. Nothing. The portkey chamber. She'd set it on the table briefly to sign the mission manifest. Standard procedure, they'd said. Temporary measure. She'd pick it up again before departure. She had not picked it up again before departure. "I don't have it," she said. Something moved across his expression, not quite contempt, but in the territory. His jaw tightened. "I have mine," he said. He reached into his robes and produced it. Pale wood, slightly longer than hers, a wand she had seen do terrible things, and then later, in a courtroom, had watched him hold with something that looked remarkably like shame. He held it now with neither cruelty nor shame, but with the careful grip of a person inventorying their assets. He pointed it at a dead branch near the tree line. "Incendio?" he said. Nothing. The word dropped into the air and dissolved there, and the branch sat where it was, entirely unmoved. He tried twice more, a summoning charm, then a basic lumos, and each spell died in the space between intention and execution, swallowed by something in the air or the rock, or the particular unplottable quality of wherever they had landed. His wand hand dropped to his side. He looked at it as though it had personally disappointed him. "Anti-magic field," Hermione said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was a habit she'd cultivated and was now grateful for. "Or a suppression ward, possibly a natural one. There are documented cases of certain geological formations interfering with magical conduction. If the island is old enough, if the rock composition includes significant magnetite deposits." "Granger." She stopped. "I understand the theory," he said. "What I'm asking is whether you can fix it." She pressed her lips together. "Without my wand, without access to any magical instruments, without knowing the precise nature or source of the interference, no, not immediately." He absorbed this. His expression did not change, which somehow made it worse. She would have preferred anger, she thought. Anger was familiar, catalogued, something she knew how to navigate. This careful blankness was something else. "The portkey coordinates," she said, pulling herself back to what was practical. The mission was to survey unregistered magical sites in the North Atlantic quadrant. If the portkey malfunctioned rather than being tampered with, we might be within the original survey radius, which means ministry tracking charms will locate us eventually, Standard missing persons protocol activates after 24 hours. And until then, it wasn't a question, but it required an answer. She looked at the island, the trees, the rock, the grudging strip of shore, the sky that offered nothing in the way of comfort. Somewhere behind a wall of cloud, the sun was moving, and the air carried the particular bite that meant temperature would drop sharply after dark. Until then, she said, we need shelter, fresh water, and fire, in that order. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you've been on survival training. Post-war aura preparedness seminar. You? Something ghost across his face that was not quite a smile. 7th year, different context. She knew what the different context was. She did not say so. Can you start a fire without magic? She asked instead. Probably. Then start there. I'll look for fresh water. She was already moving, assessing the terrain, the way the rock rose toward the interior of the island, where trees suggested soil, and soil suggested the possibility of a spring. She had gone perhaps 10 steps when his voice reached her. Granger! She turned. He was standing where she'd left him, wind-scoured and entirely out of place against this wild grey backdrop. And he was looking at her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not the contempt she expected, not the performance of indifference she'd come to recognize as his preferred public face. Something quieter, something that looked, if she was being dangerously honest, like a person taking stock of a situation and finding it frightening. Don't go far enough to lose sight of the shore, he said. The rock formations are unstable. You can feel it in the surface. Listen for hollow sounds underfoot. She stared at him for a moment longer than was strictly necessary. Thank you, she said finally, and meant it in a way that surprised her. He turned away before she could see what that did to his expression. The spring was where she'd hoped, a thin thread of water emerging from the base of a rock formation half a mile inland, cold enough to ache against her fingers and clear enough to suggest it was safe. She cupped her hands and drank and let herself have 30 seconds of something close to despair before she packed it neatly away in the place she kept such things and started back toward the shore. He had, as promised, started a fire. It was small but deliberate. A careful construction of dry branches and stripped bark and what appeared to be a nest of dry seagrass, arranged with a precision that suggested either training or the kind of focused attention people develop when idleness is more frightening than work. He was feeding it with a stick when she returned, crouched on his heels, his face turned away from her. The light caught the line of his jaw, and she looked away from that too. There's a spring, she said. Inland, northeast. The water's clean. Good. He added another branch to the fire. I found a rock overhang on the western face, deep enough to sleep under if the weather holds. She crouched down opposite him, across the small fire. Up close, she could see a cut on the back of his left hand from the landing. A clean line, already beginning to close, but still seeping slightly. He hadn't mentioned it. She suspected he hadn't intended her to notice it. She did not mention it either. Not yet. We should establish some ground rules, she said. He looked up from the fire. Of course we should, he said, and the tone was dry enough that she couldn't entirely tell whether he was mocking her. I'm serious. I know you are. You're always serious. He sat back on his heels, watching her across the flame. Go on then. She held his gaze steadily. We share resources. We split tasks according to practical ability, not hierarchy. We don't revisit the past. A long pause. The fire shifted and sent a thread of smoke between them. "That last one," he said. "Who's that for?" The question landed somewhere in her chest with more precision than she'd expected. Her fingers found the hem of her sleeve, and she stopped herself from straightening it, a gesture she recognized and refused to surrender to. "Both of us," she said. He looked at her for a moment longer, that unreadable, careful grey attention, and then he nodded once, the way she imagined he signed documents, final, without ceremony. "Both of us," he agreed. The fire burned between them, small and deliberate, and very much alone in all that cold and dark. Above the island, the cloud shifted, and for just a moment, something that might have been a star became visible in the gap before the dark closed over it again. Hermione pulled her knees to her chest and watched the flame and did not look at him again. But she was aware of him the way you're aware of a sound you can't quite place. Constant, peripheral, asking a question you're not ready to answer. She woke before dawn to the sound of rain. It came in from the west, the way all difficult things seem to, without announcement, without the courtesy of gradual approach, simply arriving at full presence as though it had always been there and she was the one who'd been absent. It moved across the water in a grey curtain and hit the rock overhang above her head with a sound like applause from an audience that didn't particularly care whether she'd enjoyed the performance. She lay still for a moment, cataloguing sensation the way she'd learned to do in the months after the war, when waking had sometimes been its own small emergency. Stone beneath her, the rough weave of her ministry robes pulled tight against her shoulders, the smell of damp rock and extinguished fire, and, beneath both of those, something she identified after a moment as the particular soap the ministry supplied for field kits. Clean, impersonal, the olfactory equivalent of a form letter. And warmth. Closer than the fire had been. She turned her head. Draco Malfoy was asleep approximately 18 inches to her left. At some point in the night, she had no memory of when, no sense of how the geography of their sleeping arrangements had shifted. The distance she'd carefully established between them had contracted. He was on his back, one arm across his chest, his face turned slightly toward her, and in sleep he looked like a different problem entirely. The careful arrangement of his features, that controlled surface-level composure he wore the way other people wore armor, had loosened. What remained was simply a face. Young, she thought, with a discomfort she didn't welcome. Too young for the things it had been asked to carry. She sat up slowly, so as not to wake him. The rain intensified. Beyond the overhang's lip, the island had become a study in grey. Grey water, grey sky, grey rock running dark with water. And she understood with the particular clarity that comes at dawn that they were not going to be rescued today. The tracking charms would need stable atmospheric conditions to function properly. She knew this from the seminar, from the small print of the preparedness documentation she'd read 3 times on the Portkey journey over. 24 hours, she had told him. She had believed it when she said it. She wasn't sure she believed it now. Behind her, she heard him breathe differently, the shift from sleep to waking, that small catching adjustment. And then the quality of the silence changed in a way that told her he was looking at the back of her head. "It's raining," she said, without turning. I noticed. His voice carried the particular roughness of first waking, stripped of its usual careful modulation. She filed this away without meaning to. The fire's out. Also noticed. She turned then, because continuing to face the rain while conducting a conversation was a form of avoidance she refused to indulge in. He'd pushed himself upright, forearms resting on his knees, watching the downpour with an expression she was beginning to recognize as his thinking face. Not blank exactly, but very still, everything directed inward. We'll need to rebuild it when this stops, she said. I saw enough dry wood sheltered under the eastern tree line yesterday, and we should think about food. There'll be shellfish on the rocks below the waterline, he said. Mussels, possibly limpets. If the water clears enough to see, there may be fish in the shallows. She looked at him. My family had a coastal property, he said, and the careful neutrality with which he said the words, my family, told her everything she needed to know about how much weight they carried. I used to walk the shore when I wanted to be. He stopped, reconsidered. When I was young. She did not push at the gap where the sentence had been. She had agreed, after all, not to revisit the past, and she found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, wanting to honour that, not out of indifference to what the past contained, but because she had a growing sense that the only way the next days were survivable was if they were allowed to be days without history. Can you clean and prepare them? She asked. The shellfish? Yes. He glanced at her. Can you? I can learn. Something shifted in his expression, not quite amusement, but in the neighbourhood. That's not the same thing. It's close enough. The rain continued. The sky offered nothing in the way of brightening. She drew her knees up and rested her chin on them, and watched the water run in thin rivers across the rock toward the sea. And she was aware of him beside her in the particular way of enclosed spaces, the peripheral sense of another body's warmth, the way sound behaved differently with two people sharing it. Granger. Why were you assigned to this mission? She kept her eyes on the rain. Standard rotation. The Department of Magical Artifacts needed 2 field evaluators. I was available. A pause. Why were you? Same. He was quiet for a moment. I didn't know you'd be there until I arrived at the chamber. Neither did I. She considered whether to leave it at that. I would have said something if I'd known in advance, about preferences. Would you? It wasn't quite a question. To the assignment coordinator, I would have asked about alternatives. She felt the need to be precise about this. Not cruel, but accurate. Not because of... She gestured vaguely at the air between them, at the layered, complicated history it contained. Professionally, working with people you have an uncomfortable history with creates operational risk. Operational risk, he repeated. Yes. Another silence. The rain came down. Somewhere beyond the overhang, a bird she couldn't identify called once, and then did not call again. I requested you, he said. She turned her head sharply. He was looking at the rain, not at her. His profile was steady, offering nothing, and the deliberateness of that steadiness told her he'd known exactly what he was saying, and had chosen to say it anyway. What? The coordinator asked if I had a preference for field partners. I said your name. A muscle worked in his jaw. You're the best evaluator in the department, That's not sentiment, it's documented performance. I wanted the best person available for a potentially complex survey. She stared at the side of his face. He did not turn. You could have told me that in the chamber, she said. I was going to. A pause that lasted precisely long enough to mean something. You didn't look particularly pleased to see me. She thought of the chamber, the moment she'd walked in and found him already there, leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, and the way her entire body had performed a swift, involuntary reassessment of the room. She had, she acknowledged privately, not looked pleased to see him. She had looked like someone who had arrived at a situation unprepared and was calculating at speed how to rearrange their face. I was surprised, she said. I know. She turned back to the rain. The information sat between them, neither comfortable nor entirely unwelcome. A piece of furniture that had arrived without her ordering it, and that she would need time to work out where to put. He had requested her. She found she didn't know what to do with that, so she set it aside with the careful deliberateness of someone placing something fragile on a high shelf and stepping back. The rain stopped mid-morning. They rebuilt the fire in a silence that had shifted somehow, less armored than the silence of the previous evening. Not friendly exactly, but no longer the specific quiet of two people maintaining careful distances. She gathered wood from the eastern tree line as he'd suggested. He disappeared down the rocks toward the waterline and returned 20 minutes later with a collection of mussels in the makeshift bowl of his folded jacket hem. She watched him open them with a flat piece of flint, the movements practiced, economical. You've done that before, she said. Told you. He worked the shell open and set it on a flat rock near the fire. Coastal property. When did you stop going? He paused for only a fraction of a second. She might have missed it if she hadn't been watching. 5th year. She did the arithmetic without wanting to. 5th year. The year everything had accelerated, hardened, become irreversible. I'm sorry, she said. The words came out before she decided to say them, and she sat with their aftertaste for a moment, checking them for dishonesty and finding none. She was sorry. Not for him, specifically, not in the way that absolved anything, but for the coastal property and the young boy who had walked its shore, and the moment when that had simply stopped being available to him. He looked at her. A long look, considered and very direct. For what, specifically, he asked. For whatever it was that made 5th year the end of something. His hands had gone still on the flint. She watched him decide, quite visibly, whether to close this down or leave it the way it was. Open, a little raw at the edges, asking something of both of them. He left it open. It wasn't one thing, he said finally. It was a series of doors, each one closed a little more than the last. He returned to the muscles, his movements resuming their steadiness. I'm not asking you to understand that. I don't need to understand it, she said. I just... She stopped, tried again. I think I was very certain for a very long time that things were simple, that people were simple. A pause. I'm less certain of that now. He didn't respond immediately. The fire crackled. The sea continued its ancient, indifferent business beyond the rocks. That must be uncomfortable, he said. For you, specifically. Incredibly, she said, with enough dry precision that something in his expression shifted. a fractional movement at the corner of his mouth, there and then contained, but there. She felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, subtle, bodily, informing. They ate the mussels from the shells with their fingers, sitting close to the fire in the thin warmth of the cleared morning. And she thought about doors that closed in sequence, and about the boy who had walked a coastal shore, and about the particular quality of his laugh when it was suppressed, a compression rather than an absence. She caught herself thinking it, and stopped. She straightened her sleeve instead, smoothing the cuff with 2 precise fingers, and focused her attention on the middle distance where the sea was beginning, reluctantly, to show a little light. But the thought had already completed itself before she'd interrupted it. She found, against all the accumulated evidence of her better judgment, that she wanted to hear that laugh at full volume, just once. Just to know what it sounded like, unconstrained. She filed this away on the same high shelf as the information about the assignment request, in the growing collection of things she was not yet ready to examine, and watched the light spread slowly across the water as the morning arranged itself around the 2 of them with the quiet, deliberate patience of something that intended to keep going, regardless of whether they were ready. The days developed a shape, not a comfortable one, not the kind of shape that comes from chosen routine, from the small voluntary architecture of ordinary life. This was the shape that necessity imposes, angular and unglamorous. Water before dawn, fire maintenance through the morning, food from the rocks at low tide, shelter reinforced against the wind that came each evening from the northwest with a persistence that felt almost personal. They divided the work without discussing it. She managed the fire, its feeding, its geometry, the careful arrangement that kept it burning through the damp nights. He managed the food, moving along the rocks at low tide with a sureness of foot that still surprised her, returning with whatever the sea had left in the pools. In the afternoons, when the light was at its best, she searched the interior of the island for anything useful. Edible plants, materials for insulation, the slow and methodical accumulation of small advantages against the fact of their situation. He came with her the 3rd afternoon. She hadn't invited him. He simply appeared at her side as she set off toward the tree line, falling into step with a casualness that suggested he'd decided something without announcing it. And she adjusted her pace without comment, and they walked together into the island's interior in a silence that had, she noticed, lost most of its edges. The interior was stranger than the shore, denser, older feeling, the trees growing in configurations that suggested long isolation from human interference. Lichen covered everything in shades of grey and yellow-green, and the ground between the roots was soft with decades of accumulated leaf fall. And the quality of the light filtering down through the canopy was the particular underwater gold of late afternoon in places where the trees are old enough to have opinions. "There," she said, crouching beside a cluster of low-growing plants near a mossy rock. "I think these are wood sorrel. They're edible. The leaves are sour but nutritious." She examined one carefully. The leaf shape is distinctive. Trifoliate, heart-shaped leaflets. "You're certain?" He crouched beside her, closer than strictly necessary for the purpose of plant identification, and studied the cluster with the same systematic attention he gave everything. Reasonably. She glanced sideways at him. He was near enough that she could see the fine detail of his jawline, the way 2 days of growth had changed the cartography of his face. She returned her attention to the plant. I wouldn't feed it to anyone I was uncertain about. High praise, he said, being worth your certainty. She looked at him again. He was examining a leaf, turning it between his fingers with a scholar's focus, and his tone had been so dry and even that she couldn't be entirely sure whether what he'd said was weighted or simply an observation. She decided to treat it as simply an observation. "There's more further up the slope," she said, straightening. "And I saw what might be wild garlic yesterday, past the second ridge. If I'm right, it changes the culinary situation considerably." "The culinary situation," he repeated, standing beside her, and this time she was certain, something in the way his voice shaped the phrase, the barely there lift at the end, that he was amused. "We've been eating mussels for 3 days." "We have. Unseasoned. I'm aware." "Wild garlic," she said, "would be an improvement." He was quiet for a moment. Then, very quietly, at low volume, directed entirely at the middle distance, he laughed. It was brief, contained, almost immediately recalled, but it was real, and it landed somewhere in her chest with a warmth she had not prepared herself for. Nothing like the sharp, performative laughter she'd heard from him as a child, the kind that was always pointed at something or someone. This was involuntary, small, surprised out of him by the mundane absurdity of standing in a strange forest discussing unseasoned mussels with Hermione Granger. She turned away before he could see that she was smiling. The wild garlic was exactly where she'd thought. They gathered it in the fold of her outer robe, a ridiculous and somehow cheerful arrangement, and walked back through the forest in the gold afternoon light, with the smell of it rising green and sharp between them. She talked about the island's geology, about suppression wards, about a paper she'd half-written the previous winter on the intersection of natural magical phenomena and ministry regulation that she'd never finished, and she was aware, as she talked, of the particular quality of his attention. He didn't interject, didn't redirect, didn't perform the polite impatience she was used to from people who were waiting for her to pause, rather than actually listening. He listened as though the information was of genuine interest, and twice he asked questions, precise, intelligent questions that required her to think before she answered. And each time she answered, she felt the odd and slightly dangerous pleasure of being heard by someone she'd assumed would never bother. "You never finished the paper," he said, as they emerged from the tree line onto the open rock of the island's midsection. "No." "Why not?" She adjusted her grip on the gathered robeful of garlic. "I got distracted by other work. The department was understaffed, and there was always something more immediately pressing." "That's not why." She stopped walking. He stopped a half-step later and turned to look at her, and there was nothing aggressive in the way he said it. No challenge, no cruelty. Simply the quiet certainty of someone who has been listening carefully enough to hear what's underneath the words. "What makes you think you know why?" she said. "I don't," he said. "But I know that other work is what someone says when the real reason is something they don't want to examine." A pause. He shifted his weight slightly an almost imperceptible adjustment. I've said it enough times to recognize it. The afternoon light sat between them, warm and impartial. The sea moved beyond the rocks with its constant, unhurried sound. "I was afraid it wasn't good enough," she said, and hated how cleanly the words came out, how little resistance they offered. Not technically. Technically it was sound. But I kept thinking, what's the point of it? What does it actually change? And I couldn't answer that. And without an answer, I couldn't. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a name for. Not pity. She'd have felt the instinct to reject pity. Something else. Something that looked as though it recognized a landscape it had visited before. "You should finish it," he said. "Perhaps." Not perhaps. His voice was even, certain and completely without the condescension that certainty usually carried from him in her memory. "It's good work. I've read some of your departmental reports. You write with precision, and you think in connections that other people miss." He paused. "Finish the paper." She stared at him. The silver ring on his right hand, the plain one, not the Malfoy signet, the one she'd noticed but not remarked on, caught the light as his hand shifted against the fabric of his robes. "You've read my departmental reports," she said. "We work in adjacent departments. Relevant material crosses over." Draco. His name. She hadn't planned it. It arrived in the space between them with a weight that neither of them pretended not to notice, and she watched something happen in his expression. A swift, involuntary opening, immediately and carefully closed. "Hermione," he said, very quietly, returning it, an acknowledgement. The garlic smell rose between them, green and alive, and the sea moved, and the light held them both in that ridiculous, impossible moment on the black rock of an unplottable island. And she felt the atmospheric pressure of the space between them change in a way that had nothing to do with weather. She looked away first. "We should get back to the fire," she said. "It'll need feeding before dark." "Yes," he said. They walked back along the rock in a silence that had changed again, deeper now, carrying something that hadn't been in it before, something that had no name yet, but occupied space as surely as any solid thing. That night, the fire burned well. She'd threaded the garlic between the mussels on a makeshift skewer of green wood and held it over the flame until the shells opened in the heat, and the smell that rose from them was something that could almost, generously, be called a meal. She handed his to him with a solemnity she didn't entirely mean, and he accepted it with an equal solemnity that she suspected he entirely did mean. "Well," she said after a moment. He chewed, considered. "Better. Considerably better, I'd say." The corner of his mouth moved. "Considerably." She ate her own and looked at the fire, and the night settled around the island with the particular intimacy of darkness in places far from other light. No ministry windows, no street lamps, no neighbouring towers, just the fire and the stars where the cloud had thinned, and the low, continuous sound of the sea reminding them of its presence. "Tell me something," she said. "Not a demand, something softer than that." He looked at her across the fire. "The coastal property," she said. "What was it called?" A pause long enough that she thought he might not answer. "It wasn't named," he said. "My father considered naming properties ostentatious unless they were the primary seat. A beat." I always thought that was rich, coming from someone who lived in a manor. Something wry and dark in the way he said manor, the word carrying the full weight of everything Malfoy Manor had become, all the rooms and corridors of it that she had personal and unambiguous reasons to remember. She felt the shift. He felt her feel it. She could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his gaze dropped briefly to the fire. "I'm not going to pretend," he said quietly, "that saying the word doesn't." He stopped, his left hand pressed flat against the rock beside him. "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't mean something, that it's you, specifically." The fire between them was very steady. "I know," she said. "I'm not pretending either." "Then what are we doing?" Not hostile, genuinely asking. She thought about it, really thought about it, which was the only kind of thinking she was capable of, and which had its costs in situations like this one, where careful thought led you directly to things you'd rather leave unexamined. "I think," she said slowly, "we're finding out who we are when the context is removed. The school, the war, the sides, the..." She gestured at the air, at history, at all the accumulated scaffolding. "All of it, when none of that is available." He was quiet for a long moment. The fire shifted. A coal settled with a soft, collapsing sound. "And who are you?" he asked, without the context. She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Someone who talks too much," she said, "who is afraid her work isn't meaningful, who finds it difficult to ask for help." She looked at him directly. "Who is sitting on an unplottable island, feeling inexplicably less alone than she expected to." The last words cost her something. She felt the cost and paid it anyway. He looked at her across the flame for a long, undefended moment. And in that moment, she saw it, all of it. The grief and the guilt and the long exhaustion of someone who has been performing composure for so many years. The performance has begun to hollow out the thing it's covering. She saw it, and she did not look away. "I don't know who I am without the context," he said at last, low, stripped of everything extraneous. "I'm not sure I've found out yet." "That's the most honest thing you've ever said to me," she said. "That's a low bar." "It's a start." Something settled between them with that, not resolution, nothing so clean. More like the moment a fracture stops spreading. The fire burned low and warm, and the stars multiplied above the island, and neither of them moved to increase the distance that had been, over the course of 3 days, and a forest and a handful of wild garlic, quietly and without ceremony, reduced to almost nothing. She fell asleep before him. She knew, in the last thin margin of waking, that he was still sitting up, watching the fire, or the stars, or something she couldn't see. And she felt his presence at her periphery, the way you feel the warmth of a lamp you've stopped looking at directly. Constant, unannounced, there. She found his journal on the 5th morning. Not intentionally. She would want that on record, if records were the kind of thing this island kept. She had been searching the inner pocket of his ministry robes, which he'd left draped over a rock near the fire while he went to check the tide pools, looking for the small folded map of the survey quadrant. She remembered him tucking away in the portkey chamber. A practical search, entirely justified, undertaken with the brisk efficiency of someone who had no interest in anything other than cartographic information. The journal was small, bound in dark green leather, worn soft at the corners. and it fell open when she lifted it, because something had been pressed between its pages. A dried sprig of something she didn't immediately recognize, grey-green and papery, that scattered fragments across the rock as the cover fell back. She should have closed it. She knew, with the clear and immediate certainty of someone who had spent 6 years being precise about ethical boundaries, that she should have closed it without reading a single word and replaced it exactly where she'd found it and never mentioned it. She read one line before she could stop herself. I keep thinking she's going to remember who I am. She closed it. Her hands were very steady. She was proud of that steadiness, and simultaneously aware that it meant nothing. That the steadiness of hands and the steadiness of the thing inside the chest are entirely unrelated phenomena, and that one can be performing perfect physical calm while something elsewhere is rearranging itself without permission. I keep thinking she's going to remember who I am. She replaced the journal. She found the map. It had been in the outer pocket all along, which she should have checked first. She took the map and left everything else exactly as it was, and walked back to the fire and sat down and smoothed the map against the rock with 2 flat hands, and stared at the survey coordinates as though they contained information she urgently needed. She was still sitting like that when he returned. He dropped a collection of limpets onto the flat rock he designated as their preparation surface, and crouched beside them, producing the flint from his pocket. And she watched him work in her peripheral vision and thought about one line of ink on soft green leather and felt the ground beneath her. Certainties shift slightly, the way solid earth shifts in the moment before you understand it isn't solid. I keep thinking she's going to remember who I am, as though who he was something she might forget, as though forgetting were mercy, as though he were waiting for the mercy to run out. She folded the map. The argument started over nothing, which is how the significant ones always start. It was afternoon, grey and close, the sky pressing down with the particular oppressiveness that precedes rain without committing to it. She had been trying to reinforce the overhang's windward side with a construction of branches and broad leaves, a project that had been going adequately until the largest supporting branch shifted and brought the whole arrangement down on itself for the 3rd time. She swore, comprehensively in a register she usually reserved for private moments, and kicked the collapsed structure, and immediately felt the specific embarrassment of having kicked an inanimate object in front of another person. "You're doing it wrong," he said, from behind her. She turned. He was watching her from 10 feet away with his arms folded, his expression carrying the particular quality she remembered from potions lessons. Not cruel, exactly, but weighted with the implication that the correct approach was obvious, and her failure to identify it was its own kind of information. "I'm doing it wrong," she repeated. "The load-bearing branch needs to be seated in the rock face, not balanced against it. You need a natural socket, or you'll need to create one, and you're not going to manage that by—" He gestured at the collapsed structure, whatever that was. "I'm aware of the principle," she said. "The rock face here doesn't offer a suitable socket. There's one 8 inches to the left of where you're working." She looked. There was, in fact, a natural depression in the rock face, approximately 8 inches to the left of where she'd been working. She experienced the specific and unpleasant sensation of having been correct in her approach and incorrect in her execution, which was somehow worse than simply being wrong. "You could have mentioned that before I spent 40 minutes on this," she said. "You didn't ask." "I shouldn't have to ask. If you can see a problem with what someone is doing, basic courtesy—" "I wasn't aware we'd agreed on basic courtesy," he said. "I thought we'd agreed on not revisiting the past." She stared at him. "Those aren't the same thing." "No," he said, "but you're using one to have an argument that's actually about the other, and I'd rather we were clear about that." The air between them went very still. "I beg your pardon." Her voice had dropped to the register she used when she was most serious and least willing to negotiate. "You've been different today." He unfolded his arms, his tone losing none of its evenness. "Since this morning. Whatever happened this morning, I don't know what it was. You've been—" He stopped, chose his words with visible care. "Distant. In the way that's actually the opposite of distant. The way that means you're thinking about something constantly and working very hard not to show it." Her hands wanted to find her sleeves. She kept them still. "You're imagining things," she said. "I'm not." His grey eyes were direct and entirely without performance. "I've been watching people conceal things my whole life. I'm better at reading it than almost anything else. How convenient for you." Something crossed his face at that. A flash, quickly extinguished, but she caught it. Not anger, something rawer than anger. She had aimed at his capability and hit something else, something that flinched, and the flinching told her she'd been crueler than she'd intended. She had intended to be somewhat cruel. That was the honest answer, because she was holding a line of his handwriting in her chest like a splinter, and she couldn't remove it without acknowledging how it had gotten there. "That was unfair," she said. The words tasted like effort. "Yes," he said. "It was." They stood in the grey afternoon, the collapsed shelter between them like a minor catastrophe that was also a metaphor, and she felt the fracture she'd thought had stopped spreading open another inch. "I found your journal," she said. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence from any they'd shared before. Complete, load-bearing. His expression didn't change. That was the thing she would remember afterward. Not anger, not betrayal, simply a face that went very carefully, very deliberately still, the way a person goes still when they are deciding how much of themselves to protect. "I didn't read it," she said. "I found it in your pocket when I was looking for the survey map. It fell open." A pause. "I read one line. I closed it immediately." "Which line?" he said. His voice was very quiet. She held his gaze. "You know which line." A long moment. The wind moved across the rock between them. "I see," he said. Then he turned and walked toward the eastern tree line, and she watched him go with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders, carrying the particular tension of someone who has closed a door very quietly because they don't trust themselves to close it any other way. And she stood beside the collapsed shelter and felt the full weight of the distance she'd just put back between them with both hands. He didn't come back for 2 hours. She rebuilt the shelter correctly, socket in the rock face, load-bearing branch seated properly, the whole structure sound and weatherproof, and collected fresh water from the spring, and fed the fire, and did all the practical, necessary things. And the entire time she did them, she was conducting an interior argument she was losing. She had told him because it was honest. She had told him because carrying it in silence felt like a small deception, and she'd made an implicit commitment in agreeing to the terms of their shared time here to something more than silence. She had told him because the line had been tender in a way that had reached through every layer of her practiced objectivity and touched something underneath that she hadn't been guarding carefully enough. I keep thinking she's going to remember who I am, as though memory were condemnation, as though the accumulated evidence of who he'd been was so conclusive that no subsequent data could change the verdict. She had read enough case files in the months after the war, sitting in the ministry archive with her reading glasses and a thermos of tea, and the grim, necessary task of understanding what had actually happened, to know that the evidence was not conclusive, that it was complicated in ways the clean narrative of sides and choices couldn't contain, that there was a boy in those files who had been handed a task designed to destroy him, and who had failed at it in ways that had saved lives, and who had then had to live inside the contradiction of that for the rest of his life. She had never told anyone she'd read those files. She had never told anyone what she'd concluded. She heard his footsteps on the rock before she saw him, that hollow echo on the volcanic surface he'd warned her about on the first day. And she looked up from the fire as he came back across the open ground with the unhurried gait of someone who has decided something. He sat down across from her, not beside her as he'd been sitting these last evenings. Across, the fire between them again, the way it had been on the first night. "I don't need your pity," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm not offering it." "Then what are you offering?" She looked at him across the flame, at the precise, controlled face and the grey eyes, and the way the firelight made the architecture of him look both harder and more fragile than the daylight did. "Accuracy," she said. "I'm offering accuracy." He was very still. "You've decided who you are," she said. "You've taken the worst version, the most complete indictment, and you've settled into it like it's the only available truth. And I think—" She stopped, took a breath. "I think that's easier than the alternative, because the alternative requires you to hold two contradictory things at once and not resolve them, and that's—" She knew this from the inside, from personal experience. "That's genuinely harder." The fire made small domestic sounds between them. "You don't know what I've settled into," he said. "No," she agreed, "but I read departmental reports too." Something in his expression shifted, confusion first, then a careful, dawning attention. "You read mine," he said. "You said relevant material crosses over." He stared at her, and she held his gaze and let him see that she had read them and had drawn conclusions, and that the conclusions were not the ones he was expecting. And she watched that information move through him the way light moves through water, slowly, finding all the irregular surfaces, illuminating things that had been underwater a long time. His left hand pressed flat against the rock. "Hermione," he said. Her name, again, low and unguarded, and asking something she wasn't sure either of them was ready to answer. The fire burned between them. Outside their small circle of light, the island sat in its vast, indifferent dark, the sea moving against the rock with the sound of something that would still be doing this long after they were gone. And she looked at him across the flame and felt the terrible, clarifying pull of a truth she'd been refusing to organize into language. She was not afraid of who he was. She was afraid of what that meant. The rain came back on the 6th day and stayed. Not the brief, decisive rain of the 3rd morning. This was a different weather entirely, a slow and committed grey that settled over the island like an argument that had decided to become a climate. It moved in off the sea before dawn, and it was still there at midday, and by afternoon it had become simply the condition of things, the way grief becomes the condition of things after a certain point. Not an event, but an atmosphere, something you stop noticing because it's everywhere. They stayed under the overhang. The shelter she'd rebuilt held. This gave her a satisfaction she didn't examine too closely. The solid, practical pleasure of a thing that worked because she'd done it correctly. The branch seated in its socket, the roof shedding water in clean rivulets off the outer edge. She was aware that she was drawing more comfort from the structural integrity of a makeshift lean-to than was entirely dignified. And she was also aware that dignity was a currency with limited purchasing power on an unplottable island in the North Atlantic. He sat at the overhang's edge, close enough to stay dry, watching the rain with the patience of someone who has learned that waiting is its own form of work. They had not spoken about the night before. This was, she understood, a mutual and wordless agreement. The conversation had reached an edge, and they had both stepped back from it, not because it wasn't important, but because it was too important, because the things left unsaid had a weight that required careful handling, and neither of them was certain yet of the structural integrity of what had grown between them. You don't put full weight on new ground until you're sure it will hold. So they were quiet. It was not an uncomfortable quiet. That was the thing she kept noticing. The way silence with him had changed in texture over the course of these days. The hostile vacancy of the first night replaced by something that had more in common with the silence of people reading in the same room. A shared medium rather than a distance. She was mending the hem of her ministry robe, which had torn on the 3rd day on the eastern rocks, using thread unravelled from the decorative cording on his jacket, which he'd offered without being asked. She worked with small, even stitches in the dim light, and the act of it was meditative in a way she hadn't expected. The needles pulled through fabric, the quiet accumulation of repair. "You sew," he said. "Evidently. I didn't expect that." She looked up briefly. "What did you expect?" He considered this with genuine attention, which he'd come to recognize as one of his more disarming qualities, the way he took questions seriously that other people would deflect with the first convenient answer. "I don't know," he said. "Something more efficient, a spellotape equivalent." Spellotape on fabric looks terrible and lasts 2 days. She returned to her stitching. "My mother taught me. She said that knowing how to mend things was the difference between someone who owns objects and someone who has a relationship with them." A pause. "Your mother sounds," he said carefully, "like someone who thought precisely about things. The past tense, not cruel, just accurate to the particular grief of what the war had left in her family, sat in the air between them with a gentleness she hadn't expected from him, and which, accordingly, she wasn't prepared for. Her needles stilled for a moment. "She did," Hermione said. "She does. She and my father, they're in Australia. They came back after the war." A breath. It took a long time for things to be not normal, but close to it. There are still gaps in her memory that never filled in properly. She resumed her stitching. She asks me sometimes about my childhood, about things she should remember, and I tell her, and she listens very carefully, and I can see her trying to fit it into a shape that makes sense. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it just... She stopped. Doesn't. The rain continued its soft, insistent work on the rock outside. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the performative sympathy of someone fulfilling a social requirement. 2 words with actual mass behind them, from someone who understood, she suspected, something about the particular weight of damage that can't be fully undone. She nodded once, accepting it, and kept sewing. By mid-afternoon, the rain had gentled to something that was more mist than water, and the air inside the overhang had become close enough that she stood and stretched and walked to the edge of the shelter to breathe. He followed. They stood side by side at the overhang's lip, not touching, watching the island disappear into its gauze of grey, and she was aware of him beside her with the full sensory specificity that close quarters and several days had produced. The particular warmth of him, the faint scent of wood smoke that had become characteristic of both of them, the silver ring on his right hand that caught what grey light there was when he moved. "Tell me something," she said. An echo of a previous evening, and she knew he'd recognize it. He did. A small pause that acknowledged the echo before he answered. "My father gave me that ring," he said, unprompted, which told her he'd been carrying it towards speech for some time. "When I turned 17. Not the signet, that's tradition, obligation, all the things those words mean in our family." He turned his right hand slightly, looking at the plain silver band. This was different. He bought it in a Muggle jeweller's in Edinburgh. He'd gone there for something else, I never knew what, and he saw it in the window and... He stopped. He never explained why he bought it, just gave it to me and said I should wear it. She looked at the ring, thought about Lucius Malfoy in a Muggle jeweller's, which was a configuration she'd never once imagined. "Do you know why he bought it?" she asked. "I think," he said slowly, "it was the only thing he ever gave me that he chose. Everything else was legacy, obligation, what you give a Malfoy heir. But that was just..." His jaw tightened slightly. "Something he saw in a window and thought of me." She looked at his profile, at the careful, neutral set of his features over something that was not neutral at all. "You still wear it," she said. "I still wear it." She understood this, the complexity of love for a person who has caused profound harm, the way the 2 things don't cancel each other out, but exist in terrible parallel. She understood it, and she did not say so, because some understandings are better held than spoken. Instead, she said, "My father used to fold down the corner of pages in books because he knew it bothered me, and then when I'd confront him about it, he'd act completely innocent, and he did it for years, and now..." She paused. "Now, I'd give a great deal to find a dog-eared page." He turned his head and looked at her. She hadn't meant to say quite that much. It had come out of the same opening that his words about the ring had made, a space where honesty felt more natural than its alternative. "We're quite a pair," he said, very quietly. "We are," she agreed. The mist drifted between them and the sea, and the words sat there, warm and a little dangerous, and neither of them moved to take them back. That evening, she was cold in a way the fire couldn't reach. It was internal, not fever, just the particular chill of several days of inadequate warmth finally making itself felt in the deep tissue, that bone-level coldness that has nothing to do with air temperature. She sat close to the fire and was cold, and she pulled her robe tighter and was still cold, and she was attempting to decide whether to mention this when he looked at her and apparently decided for her. "You're shivering," he said. "I'm fine. You've been fine several times today. At some point, fine becomes a habit rather than a condition." She looked at him. He held her gaze with an expression that was patient in a way she found unreasonably difficult to argue with. "I'm cold," she said. "Properly cold. The kind that's been building for days." He was quiet for a moment. Then he moved, not toward her, but toward the supplies they'd accumulated near the back of the overhang. He came back with his ministry outer robe, which was heavier than hers, lined with something that had retained its warmth, even through several days of damp, and he held it out. She stared at it. "It won't bite," he said. "I know it won't bite." "Then take it. You'll be cold. I run warm." The corner of his mouth shifted. "Ask anyone who's had to share a dormitory with me." She took the robe. It was heavier than she'd expected, and warm in the residual way of things that have been close to her body, and she pulled it around her shoulders and felt the cold in her bones begin, slowly to negotiate. "Thank you," she said. He made a small sound that was not quite dismissal and not quite acknowledgement, and returned to his side of the fire. She sat inside his warmth, his robe, his wood smoke, the particular living temperature of something that had been against his skin, and stared at the flame and thought about how strange it was, how specifically and inexplicably strange that she was sitting on a rock in the middle of the North Atlantic, wearing Draco Malfoy's coat and feeling safer than she'd felt in months. Not just warm, safer, as though safety were a quality that could be transferred through fabric. She pulled the robe tighter and said nothing. Across the fire, he had taken up a stick and was drawing something idle in the patch of dry dust near his knee. She couldn't see what, and his face in the firelight was open in the way it went when he thought she wasn't watching. Unguarded. The performance of composure absent for once, replaced by something quieter and more real, something that looked like a person simply existing inside a moment without armor. She was watching him. She knew she was watching him. She knew, with a clarity that had arrived sometime in the last 24 hours and declined to leave, that the careful distance she'd been maintaining between professional acknowledgement and something more ungovernable was no longer the distance she'd believed it to be, that it had been closing, not from one direction, but from both, and that the journal and the ring and the wild garlic in the fold of her robe and his name in her mouth at the wrong moment had not been isolated events, but a sequence, a direction. She thought about the line of his handwriting. "I keep thinking she's going to remember who I am." She thought about what she knew of who he was, the case files and the departmental reports, and the 5 days of accumulated small evidence. The careful fire and the shellfish, and the question he'd asked about her paper with the specific attention of someone who valued the answer. The way he'd said her name, the weight of the robe around her shoulders. She thought, I remember exactly who you are. That's not the problem. The problem was something else entirely. He looked up from his drawing, and she didn't look away in time, and for one unguarded moment, they simply looked at each other across the fire, with none of the careful intermediary furniture of distance or precedent or history between them. Something passed between them in that moment, wordless, magnetic, with the low, persistent pull of deep water moving under ice, and she felt it in her sternum and made no move to deny it. He looked back down at his drawing. She looked back at the fire, but the cold in her bones was gone. On the 7th morning, she found the signal fire materials. Not by accident this time. She'd been searching methodically along the island's highest ridge, a habit of practicality she refused to abandon regardless of what else was happening in the lower registers of her attention. And there they were, a natural depression in the rock, sheltered from the wind on 3 sides, filled with the kind of bone-dry driftwood that only accumulates in places long undisturbed by human hands. Enough fuel for a fire visible from a significant distance. Enough smoke, if she added the green wood from the interior, to signal anything passing within a wide radius. She stood beside it for a long moment. Then she walked back to the overhang without touching it. She needed to think. This was, she recognized with a slightly nauseating clarity of self-knowledge, a rationalization. She was someone who acted on correct information immediately, who did not defer the obvious practical choice in favor of thinking time. She had rebuilt the shelter in the rain. She had found the spring in the first hour. Thinking time was not, generally, her resource of choice. But she walked back to the overhang without touching the signal fire materials, and she told herself she needed to assess wind direction before they lit it, which was true, but not the reason. He was making the fire when she returned, crouched over the ember he'd kept alive through the wet night, with the focused attention he gave to things he'd decided mattered. He looked up when she came back. "Anything?" "There's a driftwood cache on the upper ridge," she said. "Good position for a signal fire." He read her face with the accuracy she'd stopped being surprised by. "But I want to assess the wind patterns first. Smoke direction matters for visibility." He returned to the fire. A pause. "Today or tomorrow?" "Tomorrow," she said. "The conditions this morning aren't ideal." He nodded once without pressing, and she was grateful for that and guilty about the gratitude. And she sat down beside the fire and was thoroughly, specifically honest with herself about none of it. The morning passed in its usual shape. She worked on an account of the island's geological features in the margins of the survey map, a record of what they'd found, partly for the ministry report she was already composing in her head, and partly because writing settled her thoughts the way walking settles the body, gives the moving parts something organized to do. He went to the tide pools. He returned. They ate. It was over lunch, such as it was, mussels again, which she was beginning to find almost normal. But he said, with no particular preamble, "Tell me about the first time you knew you were good at something." She looked up from her shell. "That's a specific question." "I've been thinking about what you said, about the paper, about being afraid it wasn't meaningful." He was looking at his food, not her, in the way he had when he was saying something he'd been carrying for a while and had decided to set down. I wondered whether that was new, or whether it's always been there underneath. She considered deflecting. She considered a number of deflecting routes, in fact, with the quick efficiency of long practice. She chose not to use any of them. "Third year," she said. "Before Hogwarts, I always knew I could read faster than other people, but that felt like a mechanical thing, not a real thing. But third year, there was a problem in arithmancy that Professor Vector said had no clean solution, that you had to accept a certain approximation, and I found a solution that was exact." She paused. "She kept me after class and asked me to walk her through it, and She stopped, remembering the expression on Professor Vector's face, the quality of attention. She was actually surprised, and I realized that surprised was good. That surprised meant I'd done something that went past what was expected. "And the fear?" he asked. "When did that start?" She turned her shell over in her hands. "I think it was always alongside it," she said. "Two things in the same space. The knowing and the, what if this is the last time? What if the next thing is the thing I can't do?" He was quiet for a moment. "That's not something I'd have attributed to you." "No," she said. "It isn't something I advertise." He looked at her then, and the quality of the look was the kind that asks a question without using words, that opens a space and leaves it open and waits to see what you choose to put there. "Your turn," she said. He set his shell down. "Potions," he said, without hesitation. "Fifth year, when I understood that I didn't need the instructions to get the result, that I could feel the way the potion was moving and adjust." Snape noticed and said nothing to the class, but he moved my work to the front shelf. That was sufficient. It was the first time someone acknowledged it. It was the first time someone acknowledged it in a language I believed, he said. My father acknowledged things constantly, but acknowledgement from him always came with a ledger. What you'd done, what you still owed, what the acknowledgement was going to cost you later. His right hand turned slightly, the silver ring catching the light. Snape just moved the work to the front shelf and went on teaching, and there was nothing attached to it. She understood this more precisely than she wanted to. The specific nourishment of praise that has no agenda, that costs nothing and demands nothing, and is simply accurate. He was cruel in other ways, she said, carefully. Yes, he said, simply, not defending. He was. The two things existing in the same space. She recognized the structure. In the afternoon, the sun appeared for the first time in 2 days, and it changed the island so completely it was almost insupportable. The dark rock warming to a deep reddish brown, the sea going from grey to something that was almost blue, the sparse trees casting actual shadows for the first time since their arrival. She turned her face up to it instinctively and felt the warmth on her closed eyelids, like something she'd been rationing and could now spend freely. She was standing on the open rock of the midsection when she heard him come up behind her. "Winds from the northeast today," he said. She opened her eyes. "That's good for the signal fire," he said. The smoke would carry southwest toward the main shipping routes. He was standing close, not in a way that announced itself, but in the way that had become their normal proximity over days of shared small spaces, the comfortable radius that had quietly contracted from careful distance to something entirely different without either of them signing anything. She looked at the wind on the water. "Yes," she said, "today would be ideal." Neither of them moved toward the ridge. The The sun was warm on her face, and the sea was almost blue, and she was excruciatingly aware of him beside her, of the 2 or 3 inches of air between his arm and hers, of the way the warmth of him competed with and complemented the warmth of the sun in a way she was no longer pretending not to notice. "Hermione," he said. Her name in his voice had developed over these days a specific quality she had no neutral vocabulary for. It was different from how other people said it, less familiar in the casual, unremarkable way of long association, and more familiar in a way that felt earned, particular, as though he'd learned the shape of it from the inside. "I know about the driftwood," he said. She looked at him. His face was turned toward the sea, his profile steady in the sun. "I went up to the ridge yesterday evening, while you were checking the spring." A pause. "The wood has been there since before we arrived. The wind was adequate yesterday morning." She said nothing. The sea moved. A bird crossed the blue-grey sky above them, very high, going somewhere with the straightforward certainty of creatures that don't second-guess their direction. "I didn't light it either," he said, very quietly. The admission fell between them and sat there, honest and undefended, taking up exactly the space it needed to take up, no more, no less. She felt something move through her chest, something warm and frightening and entirely without precedent in any emotional category she'd previously maintained. "That's not practical," she said. Her voice was steady. She was aware of the absurdity of that steadiness. "No," he agreed. "We should light it. We should." "Today," she said. "The conditions are good." They are. Neither of them moved. The sun continued its work above them, generous and indifferent, and the sea went on being almost blue, and she stood beside him on the warm rock and felt the precise weight of what was between them, not their old static of hostility or the careful friction of negotiated truce, but something that had no previous name in the history of what they'd been to each other. Something that had been built here, out of wild garlic and driftwood, and the tooth of a flint, and one line of handwriting, and a ring from a Muggle jeweller's, out of shared silences, and the particular way he said her name. She turned to look at him. He was already looking at her. This close, in direct sun, his eyes were not simply grey. There were other things in them. A shadow of green near the iris, a warmth the low firelit evenings hadn't shown her, and something that was currently doing the thing she recognized from her own reflection in still water. The expression of a person standing at the edge of something, looking down, calculating whether the ground below is what it appears to be. "If we light the signal fire," she said, "they'll come within a day, maybe less. Yes. And we go back." A pause. "Ministry debrief. Reports. The department. Our separate offices on separate floors with the appropriate professional distance." His jaw was very still. "Adjacent floors," he said. "Adjacent," she corrected, and felt the absurd, helpless pull of something that wanted to become a smile and which she contained by the thinnest margin. "And if we don't light it today," he said. She held his gaze. "Then we don't light it today." The world held its breath. He reached up, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has made a decision and is committed to making it without ambiguity, and tucked a strand of wind-blown hair back from her face. His fingers barely grazed her temple, the touch lighter than the word touch usually implies, more like the acknowledgement of a touch, the intention of one, and it lasted perhaps 2 seconds before his hand dropped back to his side. Her heart was behaving in a way that her healer would probably have wanted documented. "Tomorrow," he said. "We light it tomorrow." She nodded. Her voice was not available for comment. "Today," he said, "I think you should finish telling me about the arithmancy problem." She looked at him, this careful, complicated, quietly devastating person, and breathed. "It was a double variable harmonic series," she said. "The approximation everyone accepted left a remainder of 0.03, which sounds negligible." "But bothered you?" "Enormously." "Show me," he said. She turned toward the flat expanse of pale rock nearby, where the surface was smooth enough to draw on, and she crouched and found a sharp-edged pebble and began to write out the series from memory, the numbers coming back with the particular ease of things learned when you were most yourself. And she was aware of him crouching beside her to watch, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers, close enough that the warmth of him was a constant peripheral presence. She worked through the series, and he followed it with complete attention and asked one question at the crucial step, precisely the right question. And she felt the old familiar electricity of a mind keeping pace with hers, not performing comprehension, not waiting for the conclusion, but actually there, step by step, present in the working. When she reached the solution, she looked at him. He was looking at the numbers. "Elegant," he said. One word, specific, unembellished, and meaning what it said. She looked at the series she'd scratched into the rock, the clean line of it, the small proof that some problems have exact solutions if you're willing to hold them long enough, and thought about tomorrow, and the signal fire, and the day after tomorrow. She thought about adjacent floors and the appropriate professional distance, and about how distance is a thing that has to be chosen actively each time. She had not yet decided what she was going to choose, but she knew, sitting on the warm rock in the island's first real sun, with his shoulder a breath from hers, and the sea going blue, and the numbers still sharp in the stone, that she was closer to a decision than she'd been yesterday. And yesterday she'd been closer than the day before. They lit the signal fire at noon, not because the conditions had changed, not because either of them had decided anything with the clean finality of someone who has reached a conclusion and signed it. They lit it because the morning had arrived with a particular quality of light, hard, clear, the kind that makes everything visible whether you want it to be or not. And they had stood at the overhang's entrance, drinking water from the makeshift cup they'd been sharing for days, and looked at each other, and something in the looking had said, "Not today," had become a thing they could no longer say with any honesty. So they climbed the ridge together. The driftwood caught quickly, the dry salt-bleached timber taking the spark with an eagerness that felt almost indecent given the circumstances. She added the green wood methodically, and the smoke shifted from white to a deep grey-green, and rose in a column so clean and vertical in the still morning air that it seemed almost architectural, a thing deliberately built, a declaration. She stood back and watched it rise. Beside her, he stood with his hands in his pockets and his face turned upward, and she could not see his expression, but she could see the line of his throat, the slight movement as he swallowed, and that was enough information. "How long, do you think?" she said. "If there's a ministry tracking team active, 4 hours, maybe less." A pause. "If they've escalated to a full search, they could have a portkey team closer. 2 hours. 2 hours. She had spent the last 7 days wishing for a shorter number, and she stood on the ridge above her survival fire and found the number entirely insufficient. "We should go back to the overhang," she said. "Gather what we're taking." "There's nothing worth taking." She looked at him then. He had turned from the fire to look at her, and his face in the hard morning light was open, in a way she'd only seen in the unguarded firelit evenings, as though the same quality of illumination that made everything visible had dissolved the last layer of performance between his expression and the thing underneath it. "The map," she said. "My notes." "Your notes," he agreed. "Yes." They went back down. She gathered her things with the methodical speed of someone who is keeping their hands occupied, because the alternative to occupied hands is standing in a place where there is nothing to do but think. The survey map, her notes in the margins, the small accumulated documentation of 8 days. She folded everything with precision and tucked it inside her ministry robe, which she'd repaired with even stitches and would never look at again, she suspected, without thinking of this. He stood at the edge of the overhang and watched the smoke from the ridge. "Draco," she said. He turned. She had gathered her things, and there was nothing left to gather, and they were standing in the shelter they'd built and maintained and shared. The ash of 8 days of fires banked against the back wall, and there were perhaps 2 hours before the world they'd left resumed its claim on them, and she had something to say, and she was going to say it, because she had spent 8 days becoming someone who said things instead of filing them on high shelves. "I need to tell you something," she said. He waited with a particular quality of attention she'd come to trust, not performing patience, genuinely present. "I read your case file," she said, "after the war, in the ministry archive." She kept her voice even. "I read everyone I thought I needed to. Understand, in context, what they'd done and why, and what the evidence actually said when it was separated from..." She gestured. "Everything else." He was very still. "Yours took me 3 days," she said. "Not because it was complicated, because I kept stopping and starting again." She looked at her folded notes in her hands. "There's a testimony in there, from one of the snatchers in his own debrief, about a night in the manor, about a positive identification he said had been made, and retracted." She looked up, withdrawn, by the person asked to make it. The silence between them was absolute. She watched something happen in his face. Not shock exactly. He knew the event she was referencing. He knew what he had done. What she was telling him was simply that she knew it too, and that she had known it for 2 years and had said nothing, and was saying it now because this felt like the only moment that would ever be exactly right for saying it. His jaw worked once. His right hand pressed flat against the rock beside him. "Granger! Hermione," she said. A breath. "Hermione." The word low and fractured at one edge. "I wasn't heroic about that. I want to be clear. I was not performing a moral act. I was..." He stopped, started differently. "I was standing in my own house and I was terrified, and the alternative to what I did was something I couldn't make myself do. That's not heroism. That's just the place where fear becomes useful. I know, she said. That's why I believe it. He stared at her. If you'd claimed nobility, I'd have been skeptical, she said, but terrified and unable to make yourself do something that I believe completely. That's entirely consistent with... She paused. With everything else I know about you. Something crossed his face that she had no name for. A swift, raw undoing, contained almost immediately, like watching a building show its structure for 1 second before the facade goes back up. His eyes were very bright in the hard morning light. You've known this for 2 years, he said. Yes. And you never... No. Why? She held his gaze. Because it wasn't mine to deploy, she said. It was yours. What you did with it, whether you let it mean anything, whether you used it as a reason to rebuild something, or whether you carried it the way you seemed to be carrying it when I started working in the department. She stopped. That wasn't my decision. He was quiet for a long time. The fire on the ridge above them continued its patient work, sending its column of smoke into the clear sky, doing what it had been built to do. How was I carrying it? He said finally. When you started in the department. Like something you were punishing yourself with, she said. Like evidence for a verdict you'd already decided on. The muscle in his jaw, the flat of his hand on the stone. And now, he said. She looked at him, the careful, complicated, irrevocably real person in front of her, and felt the full weight of the last 8 days press into the present moment with the accumulated force of everything they built out of necessity and something more than necessity. Now, I think you're starting to put it down, she said. I think you've been putting it down all week, in pieces. His throat moved. That's your doing, he said, very quiet. No, she said. I've been here. The putting down is yours. He looked at her for a moment so long and so undefended that she felt it the way you feel a change in pressure. Physical, total, rearranging something in the deep tissue. Then he crossed the space between them. Not fast. Not the urgent, uncalculated movement of someone acting before thought catches up. Deliberately, with full knowledge of what he was doing, he crossed the 3 feet of overhang floor between them and stopped in front of her close enough that she had to tilt her face upward to maintain the eye contact she refused to relinquish. I don't know how to do this, he said, the words low and direct and stripped of every layer of performance. I want to be clear about that. I don't know how to be this, whatever this is. I have a long history of doing things badly, and I have... His hand came up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and settled against the side of her face with a care so precise it was almost formal. I have no interest in doing this badly. Her heart was performing something entirely outside standard parameters. You've been doing it well for 8 days, she said. Her voice was steadier than she had any right to expect. 8 days on a rock in the North Atlantic, he said, with no audience, no history, no... Those conditions don't change what was true in them, she said. His thumb moved, barely, a fraction of an inch against her cheekbone, a movement so small it barely registered as motion and registered enormously as intention. And what was true in them, he said. She was going to answer. She had the words arranged, the honest and accurate inventory of what these 8 days had produced in her. the warmth and the terror of it, the way certainty had crept up on her sideways while she was busy with fire building and wild garlic and arithmancy problems scratched in rock. She was going to say it. Then the sound reached them. High above the island, carrying clearly in the still air the unmistakable crack of apparition. Then another, then a third. And voices, urgent and professional, calling coordinates to each other in the clipped tones of a ministry search team who had found what they were looking for. They had 2 minutes, perhaps less. She looked at him. He looked at her. His hand was still against her face, and neither of them had moved, and the voices were getting closer. She could hear boots on rock now, the crunching, systematic approach of people who had been searching for 8 days and were relieved and purposeful and entirely unaware of what they were about to interrupt. "Draco," she said. "I know," he said. He didn't move his hand. "There, I know." His eyes were on hers, and they were very grey and very open, and she could see everything in them. The same thing she'd seen in the firelight the night she'd realized, the deep water pull of it, and something else now, something with more urgency, something that looked like a person who is watching a door begin to close and has not yet decided whether to go through it. She made the decision for both of them. She reached up and covered his hand with hers, the hand against her face, her fingers over his, pressing his palm to her cheek, and held it there. His breath changed, audibly. "Don't do the thing," she said, very quietly and very fast, because the boots were close now. "Where you decide this was only possible here. Where you build a door between here and there and call it being realistic." His fingers moved beneath hers, turning slightly, his hand rotating to press more fully against her palm, and the warmth of it went through her like current. "I'm not known for optimism," he said. "No," she said, "but you've been surprising me all week." The first searcher came around the rock face, a ministry aura, sharp-eyed, already raising her wand to send the all-clear signal, and stopped when she saw them, looked at Hermione, looked at Draco, looked at the way they were standing, performed the particular ministry professionalism of a person who has seen nothing and will file a report accordingly. "Granger, Malfoy." The aura's voice was brisk and warm with relief. "Merlin, you two. Are you both all right?" "Fine," Hermione said. She stepped back. Her hand fell from his. His hand fell from her face. But before it did, in the last half second before the world resumed its full claim on them both, before the aura was joined by 2 colleagues, and the small, improbable world of the island was replaced by the larger, more complicated world that had been waiting, she felt his fingers tighten once around hers. Brief, deliberate, a punctuation mark, not an ending. She looked at him. He was already looking at her, and his expression was the one she'd learned to read over 8 days of careful, accumulated attention. Not blank, not performed, entirely real. "Don't build the door," she had said. And he had tightened his fingers once around hers. She thought that was probably an answer. The ministry debrief lasted 4 hours. She sat in a room on the 3rd floor that smelled of floor polish and recycled air, and answered questions from a panel of 3 officials who were professionally sympathetic and practically thorough, and who had clearly already decided that the port key malfunction was the result of a calibration error in the departure chamber, rather than anything more concerning. She confirmed this. She submitted her notes and the annotated survey map. She described the island's geological features and the suppression ward phenomenon and the signal fire placement with the precise, comprehensive efficiency that had made her one of the department's most valued field evaluators. She did not describe anything else. Across the building, she knew, he was in a different room doing the same thing. She could feel the specific awareness of him across the floors and walls with a clarity that had nothing to do with magic, the way you can feel a weather system before it arrives, not with any particular sense, but with the whole body at once. The panel thanked her and told her she'd be contacted about the formal report and recommended she take 2 days of recovery leave. She thanked them and left the room and stood in the corridor and breathed the recycled ministry air and felt, for the first time since the auras had arrived on the island, the full weight of where she was and what it meant. The appropriate professional distance. She had her office on the 4th floor, her work, her unfinished paper, her ordinary life with its ordinary appointments, the tea she made at precisely 9:30 each morning, the particular chair she favoured in the archive on late research evenings. All of it waiting for her exactly as she'd left it, unaltered, as though 8 days on an unplottable island had not happened, as though nothing had shifted on its foundations. She walked to the lift. Her office smelled of books and the particular must of parchment left undisturbed, and she stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. Her desk, her stacked files, the small framed photograph of her parents that had gathered a faint layer of dust in her absence, and felt the strange double vision of the returned traveller, the place you've always known, made briefly foreign by the experience of elsewhere. She sat down at her desk. She opened the drawer where she kept her personal writing, letters, fragments, the occasional private note she wouldn't file anywhere official, and found the draft of her paper exactly where she'd left it. 47 pages with a gap at page 31 where she'd stopped, a pencil mark where she'd written not enough in the margin and underlined it twice. She looked at the pencil mark for a long time. Then she opened to page 31 and began to write. The words came differently than they had before, less careful, less preoccupied with their own adequacy. She wrote for an hour without stopping and covered 6 pages in a hand that was slightly less controlled than usual, slightly more alive, and when she finally looked up, the light in her window had changed and her tea had gone cold undrunk. She read back what she'd written. It was good. She knew it was good, not with the anxious, checking quality of someone performing self-assessment, but with the simple recognition of work that has found its purpose. The argument was coherent and original, and the evidence supported it. And in 3 months, perhaps 4, it would be a paper that existed in the world, rather than a draft that existed in a drawer. She thought about him saying, "Finish the paper," and felt something move through her that was warm and specific, and not at all professional. She had not seen him since the island. This was, she was aware, a period of approximately 9 hours and 40 minutes. She was not timing it. She was simply aware of it, the way you're aware of a silence after music. Not actively listening, but conscious of the shape of the absence. She did not go to the adjacent floor. She went home. The 2 days of recovery leave passed with the particular quality of time that is occupied, but not full. She cleaned her flat and finished reading 3 books she'd left suspended at various stages, and corresponded with her mother at unusual length, and slept more than she had in weeks. And in the spaces between these activities, she thought about an unplottable island and a signal fire lit at noon, and a hand against her face and fingers tightening once around hers. "Don't build the door." She had said it to him. She wondered now if she'd needed to say it to herself as well. On the morning of the 2nd day, she went to the archive. Not for her paper. She had what she needed from the paper, for now. She went because the archive was where she thought best. The long oak tables and the systematic quiet and the smell of old parchment. A kind of external order she could use to organize internal things. She found her usual chair in the back corner, and she sat in it, and she was honest with herself for a sustained and uncomfortable period of time. She was in love with him. Not in the tentative, provisional way of someone who suspects a feeling and is waiting for more data. She had enough data. She had 8 days of the most specific and attentive data she'd collected about another person in her adult life, and the conclusion was not ambiguous. It was one of those mathematical solutions that works out to something clean and exact, not approximate, not dependent on accepting a remainder. Exact. She was in love with Draco Malfoy, who had laughed quietly in a forest at the absurdity of unseasoned mussels, and read her departmental reports, and told her to finish her paper, and pressed his hand against her face with a precision that felt like a declaration. And she had been building toward it since, she thought, being rigorous about the data. Probably the 2nd morning, when he'd told her about the coastal property in a voice stripped of performance. And she'd understood that there was an interior to him she'd never once been allowed to see. The archive was quiet around her. She closed her eyes and held this conclusion and examined it from multiple angles, and found it equally true from every angle she tried. Then she got up and walked to the lift and pressed the button for the 3rd floor. His office was at the end of a corridor she'd passed perhaps twice in 2 years of working in the building, and she stood outside the door with its small brass nameplate, D. Malfoy, Department of Magical Artifacts, Senior Evaluator, and felt the full absurdity and inevitability of standing outside this particular door after 8 days on a rock in the North Atlantic, and knocked. A pause. "Come in." She opened the door. His office was different from what she'd imagined. Not sparse, as she might have predicted, but full, in the careful way of someone who chooses each thing deliberately. Books arranged by subject with the precision of a private system. A narrow window with a view of the atrium below. His desk, clear except for a single open file and a cup of tea that appeared to have been recently made. He was standing behind the desk. He had clearly heard her footsteps in the corridor. She suspected he'd known it was her before she knocked, from the way he was standing, the quality of his stillness. And he was watching her with an expression that was the same one she'd learned over 8 days, the one that was open in the specific way of someone who has made a decision about what they're willing to show. She closed the door behind her. "I finished 6 pages, she said. "Of the paper. Of the paper." A breath. "It's good. I know it's good. I think it might be the best thing I've written." "I know," he said. "You haven't read it." "I know anyway." His voice was even, certain and entirely without arrogance, simply accurate. She stood inside the closed door of his office and looked at him, and felt the accumulated weight of 8 days and 9 hours and 40 minutes press into the present moment with the full force of everything it contained. "I told myself I was coming to tell you about the paper," she said. "Are you?" "No." He moved from behind the desk. Not the rapid movement of urgency, measured, deliberate, the same way he'd crossed the floor of the overhang. And he stopped in front of her, and she looked up at him, and neither of them looked away. "I've been building a door," he said. Her heart turned over. "This morning," he said, "I sat in my office and I built approximately 4 versions of a very reasonable door, and I have spent the last several hours becoming aware that I cannot make myself go through any of them." His voice was low and steady and completely unperformed, which is either weakness or something else entirely, and I find I don't care which it is. "It's something else entirely," she said. "Hermione." Her name in his voice, with all 8 days inside it. "I know," she said. "I know who you were. I know what the war made of you. I know what you made of yourself in it and after it, and I have read the evidence and reached a conclusion, and the conclusion is..." She stopped, started again more accurately. "The conclusion is that I would like you to do what you were about to do on the island before the search team arrived." Something shifted in his expression, all the remaining careful distance dissolving at once, the last performance falling away. And what was underneath was simply him, unguarded and entirely present. And looking at her with an attention so complete, she felt it the way she'd felt his hand against her face. He reached up and tucked the same strand of hair from her face, unhurried, certain, his fingers barely grazing her temple. And this time, there were no aura boots on rock to interrupt it. His hand stayed. She felt his palm warm against her cheek, and she turned her face into it slightly, the smallest movement, and heard his breath change the same way it had changed on the island when she'd covered his hand with hers. "I meant what I said," he said, very quietly. "I don't know how to do this well. I have a considerable history of..." "So do I," she said. "We'll manage." "That's not the most romantic position I've heard taken." "It's accurate," she said. "And it's honest. And it's..." She looked at him steadily. "It's what I have. I'd rather give you what I actually have than what sounds better." His thumb moved against her cheek. "That," he said, low and certain, "is the most romantic thing I've heard in my life." She laughed, surprised out of her, brief and real, and she felt his expression change at the sound of it, something softening all the way through. And then his other hand came up to frame her face, and he leaned down and kissed her. Slowly, with the same deliberateness that characterized everything he'd done in the last 8 days. No performance, no urgency that was about anything other than this specific moment. His mouth was warm and careful, and the kiss tasted of new things, and old things resolved, and she felt it through her whole body, the way she'd felt the warmth of his robe on the cold night, the same deep settling, the same specific relief of something that had been held in tension finally, completely released. She kissed him back with equal care. Her hands found the lapels of his robes, not gripping, simply there, her fingertips against the fabric, and the world outside his narrow window continued its ordinary business. The atrium below full of ministry foot traffic and professional distance and all the social machinery that had kept them apart for years. And none of it had any weight in this room, in this moment, where everything was simple in the way that only true things are simple. He pulled back slightly, not far. His forehead came down to rest against hers, and they stayed like that for a moment, close, his hands still framing her face, her hands still against his lapels, both of them breathing. "The island," he said quietly. "Yes," she said. "It was real there." "It was real there," she agreed. "And it's real here. In your office, on the 3rd floor with the brass nameplate and the tea." She felt him smile, not saw it, felt it in the change of his face against her temple. "The tea is cold," he said. "I know. Mine was too." She pulled back enough to look at him properly, at the open and unguarded face that she had spent 8 days learning, and intended to spend considerably longer learning still. "We could go somewhere and get warm ones." He looked at her. "Together," she said, precise and unambiguous, because she had never learned to do anything else. Not as colleagues on adjacent floors, not as people who survived something and are being practical about it. She held his gaze. Together. His hands were still warm against her face. "Together," he said. Not a question, not a negotiation. Simply a word that meant exactly what it meant, given freely, held without conditions. She thought about an unplottable island, and a spring, and a fire built with careful hands, and a line of handwriting on soft green leather, and the way his laugh had sounded when it was real. And she thought, this is what it looks like when something begins properly. Not with flourish, not with drama. With two people standing in an ordinary room choosing, clearly and without ambiguity, to be where they are. She took his hand. He held it. They went for tea.
This story is about two people who had every reason to stay strangers. They had history, they had pain, they had years of choosing opposite sides. But the island took all of that away. No titles, no roles, no audience, just two people, cold night, a small fire, and nowhere to hide. And that is when something true began, not because they forgot the past, but because they chose to look past it, to look at the person standing right in front of them. Draco was not a hero. He never claimed to be. He was just a man trying to put something heavy down. Hermione was not perfect. She was afraid. She doubted. She almost built a door between them and walked away. But she didn't. And that is the whole story, really. Two people choosing each other, slowly, honestly, without pretending it was easy. I think we all have someone in our life who I almost didn't let in. Someone we almost missed. Someone we almost missed. This story is for them, and maybe it's for you too. Thank you for listening.